the challenge, the opportunity to connect. The 1960s, a time of imagination and change, a time of anger and fear. The 1960s, a program called Challenge.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen.
Looked at our connections, our divisions, through the lens of faith. Nearly 60 years later, during these challenging times, we'll take a new look at our divisions, our connections, in a new program called Challenge 2.0. In last week's edition of Challenge 2.0, we began to explore the convergence of climate change, scientific understanding, and faith. This week, we examine the call to action of not only the vast majority of scientists, but also a growing number of faith leaders who are calling for a change to business as usual and a re-examination of the values we live by. A climate of survival, perspectives of science and faith. So again, we're very fortunate to, this week as last week, have three wonderful guests with a variety and diversity of perspectives, knowledge, and wisdom. If I can take a couple of moments to introduce them. Greg Rickel is the Bishop of the Episcopal Diocese of Olympia, and you were the Episcopal representative to the Earth Charter meeting in Geneva, Switzerland in 1997, and I believe the year after that you were personally trained by former Vice President Al Gore for the Climate Project and has been very much immersed in this issue since then. Dr. Phoebe Barnard is an affiliate professor at the University of Washington and the Chief Science and Policy Officer of the Conservation Biology Institute. I understand you worked in Southern Africa for more than 3 decades as part of the South African National Biodiversity Institute, and you bring a unique global perspective to the discussion we're having today, especially as we're going to get into increasingly in this program, sustainability. Dr. Dennis Hartman is a professor of atmospheric sciences at the University of Washington, department chair, and helped form the College of the Environment there, which is leading to some exciting things that are going on, and certainly a recognized authority on climate. He's been honored as a fellow of the American Meteorological Institute, the American Geophysical Union, and with membership in the very prestigious U.S. National Academy of Sciences. So thank you, each of you, for joining us again this week as well as last week. We closed our discussion last time looking at what we knew about anthropogenic or human-caused climate change, the impact on the oceans, the impact on the ecosystem, but that also calls into mind the impact that's having, and I think, Phoebe, you mentioned that this is having a definite fraying effect on the fabric of those ecosystems. This is also leading to fraying of sort of the fabric of the human family. Greg, what would you add to all of that?
Well, absolutely. I mean, for me, that's what I've really been paying attention to. I would say there are all kinds of examples, but the indigenous people in Alaska, for instance, along the Arctic Circle, their entire way of life's changing because of this change. Specifically, I would say, even at the Earth Charter in 1997, a Samoan, I'll never forget, said to me, I'm not going to judge you for living in the West, but you drive your SUVs while my soccer field goes underwater. And that was kind of the first reality for me, kind of face to face with we're connected on this and it has to be important for all of us. Our diocese started a direct companionship with the Diocese of the Southern Philippines, which is essentially Mindanao in the Philippines, to reforest, because deforestation is the calamity there. Again, based on economics, poverty, necessity. It's almost like the Easter Island story again of chopping down the last tree, just because that's what we know and that's what we do. And so we've worked with them directly. That's our carbon offset program at the Diocese of Olympia, directly to the Southern Philippines. We hire people, we have scientists that are actually monitoring that to see the CO2 and the tonnage that we're taking out of the air. But over that 10 years of that program, we've planted about 30,000 trees, mahogany, rubber, coconut, all trees that are sustainable, do a lot of deep breathing so that CO2 is taken in. And it takes the abstraction out for our people, because I think folks get very overwhelmed about what can I do about this. And I challenge anyone now when they say you ought to do this or you ought to divest this, or I always ask, what are you doing about this? And carbon offsets are not the answer. It doesn't change the destruction, but it, I believe, gets us connected to the problem and can help us to feel like we're doing something active about it instead of just sitting and looking at it happen.
I think it also has a big, powerful effect in terms of freeing up resources that would otherwise not be there for ecosystem restoration.
Absolutely.
And a lot of people have not made that connection, as you say. But a colleague of mine, a very interesting guy called Harry Balasubramanian, realized one day, he was working for one of the most rich and powerful conservation organizations on the planet. He realized in a back of the envelope calculation that multinational companies were spending about 14 to 16 times the entire global budget for conservation on the planet. There was this incredible asymmetry between what we were spending on protecting the earth from depredation by humans versus the fueled, well-fueled depredation itself. And he realized that instead of, kind of hoping for scraps and crumbs at the table, we needed to change the way business and the economy worked.
Yeah, I think you can't help but be attached, because I would say money is a spiritual issue for all of us too, that if you're putting some of that, you're investing in the problem. You're not just sitting back and watching it. So at the diocese, we offset all of our travel and all of that, and every time we do that, it brings to mind again, this is an issue we all have to be connected to. So just the psychological connection of that, I think, is very important. But it does actually make practical change. 30,000 trees in Mindanao, we've calculated that's about 70,000 tons of CO2 that is taken out of the atmosphere.
We might look at that, and that is that either you've participated in, you've observed, or led. What are the most effective or the most important responses that you've seen? And Dennis, I might ask you to begin with that.
So I think it's very important for people to realize that there's a way out of this. It's there are things that we can do that will not only sustain us economically, but also lead us to a better future. There is a way forward. So I think there's a sense of hopelessness that some people have, or inevitability. The people who don't want us to do anything about the environment or climate change are telling us, well, we're going to have to move back into caves and things like that. That's not true. We can have a rich human life and use energy and all those things we like to do, but we just need to do it in a different way.
So paint us a picture, if you would, each of you, in terms of what you think those important steps are, either that you've observed or that you conceive of yourself.
Well, I would just say that what I'm focused on right now, the Episcopal Church has actually, and our new presiding bishop has made this one of his top 3 priorities. So evangelism, reconciliation, and care of creation are the 3 things the Episcopal Church really focused on right now. And here in this diocese, I am encouraging people at just a practical level to do 4 things to measure their carbon footprint. So actually figure out your effect on the earth, which just that act alone, I think, can engage people on where they are. To take individual action, like carbon offsets and different things you can do, reduce, recycle, all of that. To aggregate the impacts, so try to look for ways you can connect and be a part of this in a greater way. And then to advocate for climate protection. So those are the areas we're focused on in a practical way, just with the people that we have in our diocese.
I would emphasize the third of those. I think it's very important for people to do things individually, to live better with regard to the environment. But if we're going to solve the climate problem or any other environmental problem, it's going to require coordinated action across the United States and the rest of the world. So people have to do that third thing. They have to advocate with their leaders. And we have a democratic society here. We can advocate for change. It's extremely important to do that.
I think it's important for us to recognize that we are at the crossroads of humanity here, and we have been living in the West in a system that has brought huge prosperity and predictability for many people, although it has also increased the division of wealth, the inequality of wealth, horrifically. And so we're increasingly aware that that system has become broken economically, politically, spiritually, socially, and the world doesn't have to be this way. We can change it, as I always say. But I do observe, as you say, a number of people that have become very disheartened. They are hearing messages from the media, even from science, or they think they're hearing messages from science that they are mishearing. And one of them is that when the science says that we really have only a decade left to make big fundamental changes to our economy, and radically decarbonize our energy economy. People have heard that as, we have 10 years left, full stop, and then we're all going to die. And there is no more defeating and disempowering mismessage than that. So I want to say clearly to people, if you have heard that, if you think that you believe that, come talk to us, read, because this is not the case. And I borrow something from Christianity that I learned as a kid. Although I no longer consider myself a Christian, I bring so much of the value of it into my life. That serenity mantra or serenity prayer. People really now need to have the courage to change the things that we still can change, and there are so many of them. We can reform our economy. We can change the way we travel. We can reconnect with our fellow human beings a lot better than we have done in this country especially. We have to have the serenity to accept that certain things are now set in motion. Sea level rise, for example. Even if we stopped using fossil fuels this second completely, we would not be able to protect cities from inundations. And we need the wisdom to know the difference. The courage, the serenity, the wisdom.
You have another point you wanted to make?
I'd say as the Episcopal Church has launched a website called Sustain Island Home, and I would encourage anybody to go there. You don't have to be Episcopalian or Christian to go there. And it really is trying to utilize kind of the competitiveness we have in our society. It's a gamified way for our congregations and individuals to kind of compete against each other about doing the best they can for the earth, and it gives all kinds of ideas about what you can do, especially in those 4 areas that I was talking about, including advocacy, because that's the part that is going to be very important for us to change the system, the systemic part. So,
there are a couple points I'd like to latch on to, and they're a little bit of a detour, but I think it's a worthwhile detour. We were talking, and I see this as somebody that practiced science journalism for a long time. There are some sources of very solid information, and there are lots of sources that lead to misinformation and misdirection. What would you, not to call out necessarily the poor sources, but if you were advising people to get good, solid information, what sources do you recommend in terms of climate, perhaps?
In terms of science, you go to the experts. I think one disturbing thing for me in American society is that people now tend not to accept expert opinion about things. There's a psychology where people think that, well, my opinion is just as valid as anybody else's, and if I want to think this, I can think this, and just because they have a PhD and they've studied it their whole life doesn't mean they know more about it than I do. There's a real strain of that in American society right now, so I would encourage people to go to the experts and consider the motivation of the person you're listening to. I mean, do they have a vested interest in this, or are they trying to give you just the straight facts?
Phoebe and Greg?
There's a very useful website, realclimate.org, that enables people to hear assessments from real proper scientists, climate scientists. Although it is a multilateral process, the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reports, are the fundamental basis on which much of our action is needed. The problem with it is that as a multilateral process, it's been subject to a least common denominator dilution of wording and results that every country that is party to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change will accept. So it has been too conservative, too slow in identifying many of the problems. In November 2019, I was one of 5 scientists co-authoring a paper in the journal Bioscience called World Scientists Warning of a Climate Emergency. And that paper was co-signed by now about, I think, 13,450 scientist co-signatories. And it identified 6 key areas of action that's needed for governments and society to focus on. Everything from energy transitions and efficiency to nature protection and restoration, to food systems reform, regenerative agriculture, plant-based diets, increased use of plant-based diets, economic reform from essentially an exploitative, capitalist fueled society or economy to one that is more regenerative and a little bit more focused on values other than profit and more on the common good. 5th, population stabilization. And that's a long curve. You know, we have to find non-coercive, voluntary, mindful, and well-supported ways of educating women and having the discussion globally about population. Because although overconsumption in the West is probably one of the single biggest problems that we have, it's impossible to get away from the sheer unutterable mathematics of global population overpopulation. And then finally, to find ways of just reducing short-lived atmospheric pollutants, including methane and carbon soot and other greenhouse gases. So that paper is a good source for people to look at some of the trends and some of the opportunities for action that are possible. I think we have to recognize that all of us as individuals, yes, we can do lots of things in our life, and they are all very important, but without system change, as you said, we are not going to make the fundamental we're not going to be able to make the fundamental changes that we need to in time. So we need everything, top down, bottom up, sideways paradigm shifts. But as Dennis said, it's an opportunity to live very much better. It doesn't mean going into caves, and we need to be aware that a lot of the people spreading those kinds of comments are paid to do so.
There is the element, and I think it's been touched on here, that there are those that are very much concerned about they view this as an issue of freedom of self-expression and freedom from government regulation. What is faith? What do ethics? What would each of you say to that perspective, that worry, that concern, that rejection of modes of action that are needed?
Well, I mean, for me it'd be easy because I think if you're really following Christianity, if you're really a follower of Christ, you would say that nothing is an individual endeavor. that our life together as a community is important. And so what's good for the community actually is important. I think Desmond Tutu said, Christianity is not a solitary endeavor. And I agree with that. And so for me, from a theological perspective, I would just say that's wrong thinking. If you're a person of Christianity and following that faith, it is of concern to you. Not just your liberties, but the liberty of everyone else as well, and the good and stewardship of everyone else as well, the people and also the earth. That is our faith. I mean, where I think Christianity probably needs to have the biggest conversation, and Pope Francis said this in 2015 as well, is really starting in Genesis 1:26 and what the word dominion means. That's where I would say the Christian world diverges on this, and it's a theological problem that's a big one for us. For some, dominion means it's all ours, we can use it any way we want, and we can use it up. And for others, I would include myself in this camp, dominion means stewardship. It means caring for it and leaving it better than we found it.
Any other perspectives on that?
I just follow up on that and say that humans are basically in control of the direction that the earth goes because of population and our consumption of resources. For example, sulfur is a very important element for life, etc. Humans produce about 7 times as much sulfur, putting it into the atmosphere, as all the volcanoes in the world. So we're really running the show. We are the stewards of the earth, and there's a religious reason to do that, but there's also a very practical reason for survival. They're not.
It's great when they go together.
Yeah.
And it does in this case, really.
The paradigms and the analogies that we use for our role here on Earth have changed a lot, even during my lifetime. I'm 58 now, but the best one for me was a kind of life support system in Spaceship Earth. It made clear that we are utterly dependent on the resources and the ecosystem services and processes of this planet, and we damage them at our peril. We are now realizing as a global society, too late, that we should have done these things 100 years ago, certainly 40, 50 years ago when we first started talking about it.
There's the sense of responsibility to future generations, and to basically couch it a bit in faith or spirituality terms, a sense of who is our neighbor. And it seems in many cases that has fallen away. What do you think needs to be done to recapture that sense of connection?
Dialogue. This is a time where we need to accept a deep and humble learning process and talking with neighbors, especially including Native Americans. They have had wisdom on these issues all along, and it must have been extremely painful. It still is extremely painful for them to sit and watch what the dominant culture has failed to observe about our stewardship responsibilities. Having these difficult dialogues among people that may be neighbors but have forgotten how to be able to talk to each other, establishing common ground, talking about shared universal things, whether it's children or whether it's faith or, how we interpret those things. It's almost always possible to make some headway, and often possible to make a big breakthrough with people.
Yeah, right now I would say courage. The courage to do what you just said, because we're living in an environment where that's been taken away in many, many ways, and that it's difficult to engage those difficult situations like this. And we have to have courage to be able to do it. And then I think as leaders, being able to make links, for instance, the fires in Australia will affect the planet. They, it's a long way away, but it's still going to affect us, and that's how we're connected. And I think every way we can possibly do that and show that, This is why the Southern Philippine Project for us is so important, because we've gotten to know the people. We've gone there, they've come here. It's a direct connection with the real problem on the ground. And I think that's what we've got to, that's where I'm going to put my effort, is trying to make those connections so people see that and know that.
You mentioned the fires in Australia. I might just pause a second and ask, for you over the last year, what have been the most disturbing images or stories that you've heard that relate to this topic?
There are so many. Burnt kangaroos and koalas, and people displaced from their homes through flooding and storms and wildfires. It would be almost impossible for me to identify individuals. It's causing a level of psychic horror in people that feel deeply on these issues. And so there's a need for community and dialogue just to help connect people and reestablish hope and trust and purpose and focus.
I thank you each very, very much for participating in this, and I suspect and I hope that we'll be able to look further down the road on we're making some gains and where else we need to make some gains and where there are some opportunities. So thank you again for joining us, and thank you very much for joining us on this issue of Challenge 2.0. Thank you.